Fate. Souls and Singularities Chapter 122–123. Chapter 122. Cast against a backdrop. The storm brooked no quarter throughout the march. With no cover and no opportunity for rest so early into their journey, the caravan of survivors had no other option but to grit their teeth and force their way through the blizzard. With the night sky completely blocked out by the menacing dark gray storm clouds looming overhead, the best the group could tell was that it was near enough early night. Not that it would have mattered if it were daytime either. The storm made certain that being able to see more than 5 feet in front of you was an exceptionally difficult task. Olga very much hated it. She could feel the cold creeping in around her, and even with the mystic code to protect her, the prolonged exposure was starting to wear her down, to say nothing of taking potshots to the face from the falling snow being propelled by the winds. Then there was the almost shin-deep snow at ground level that made walking a Herculean task. Whether or not the locals had a better go of it as they lived here was something that the director didn't personally care for at present. For her, it was just a thoroughly unpleasant experience. Looking over her shoulders for a split second, she had to squint her eyes to even make out the shadows of the people behind her moving through the now and then lost sight of them perhaps 10 or 12 back. The caravan itself probably stretched on for around a dozen meters, perhaps more, but as it stood you could only see a fraction of that. If they did get attacked, it would most certainly be something no one would be able to look out for until their attackers were right on top of them. Which is what Olga very much wanted to avoid in the first place, especially if they were being attacked by dragons. One of the beasts could swoop down and blast the entire caravan with a wave of fire and be back into the sky before anyone had been able to so much as catch a glimpse of it. Unless they were as difficult to spot from the air as they were to spot from the ground, she didn't want to underestimate the sensory abilities of dragons. They were ranked near the pinnacle of phantasmal beasts for a very good reason, and if it was Fafnir, then temperatures such as this would mean absolutely nothing to them. Whether it be the story about Sigurd or Siegfried, both dragons made their homes in locations that were far from tropical. Especially the Fafnir of Norse myth. Closing her eyes, she turned back around and forced herself onwards, ignoring the growing soreness in her joints as she was having to drag them through the snow, each lift of her leg feeling as though it was growing heavier and heavier. She had a dragon-slaying servant. That was fine, as long as they could ground Fafnir, then they could beat them. Besides, Fujimaru was able to defeat Fafnir, so there was no reason that she couldn't either. She was a better mage than him and the director of Chaldea itself. Being unable to do something that a civilian brought in to fill a quota could do would shame both her and the entire Animosphere family. She released a gasp as she felt her body lurch forwards, her leg getting caught on something just beneath the snow and rushing down face first into the ground. She found herself suspended about an inch from the surface of the snow, a tight grip around the back of her coat. The gasp turned into a surprised shout as she was pulled back and righted. The hulking shadow of Torin loomed over her, leaning forwards until she could just about make out the whites of his eyes before they darted down to the ground. Careful. The snow hides many dangers for those unaccustomed to marching it. His voice just about came out above the howling of the storm. Even then it was difficult for her to hear. He leaned back and turned away from her. Watch your footing. Olga rolled her jaw, clenching her teeth and biting back a response about how she knew how to walk perfectly well. She restrained herself though, he likely wouldn't have been able to hear her over the storm anyway. Shaking her head, she moved down to the communicator and activated it. Sure enough, Romani's face popped up, but it crackled every now and again as snow rushed through the image and disrupted it. Not that the audio seemed to be too affected. Glad to see you again, Director. Romani nodded to her. The woman had to strain her ears in order to actually understand what he was saying. How far have we gotten? She called back, or to be more accurate, shouted back, at the man. To her it felt like they had been walking for hours, but she wasn't entirely sure what time they had left to begin with. Her muscles were getting sore and this storm just had a way of making everything feel dragged out. You've gotten about 2 miles from your original location. Romani explained with a nod of the head. Oddly enough, he looked rather impressed at the rather low number. Which is pretty impressive when you consider that you're walking through a rather powerful storm and you left a little over 2 hours ago. 2 miles in 2 hours. The snow was slowing them down faster than she thought. At this rate it would be about half a day before they made any real distance. We shall rest after another 3 miles. Torin called back from slightly ahead of her. Olga felt the blood leave her face behind her thermal mask. That was about another 3 hours of walking, and in this weather, she wouldn't be able to last that long. He was expecting everyone else to walk in this too. Was he crazy or were the people around here just built like freaks? Either way, she couldn't let this stand. 3 miles? She shouted at him, her voice managing to penetrate above the storm as she hobbled forwards as fast as she could to try and catch up with him. She saw his pace briefly slow before it resumed, just long enough for her to catch up. At least make it one more. 3. Torin repeated again in his usual calm voice. He looked skywards. The storm is worse than I suspected and shows no sign of stopping. We must make good enough distance before we set up camp and wait it out. He looked back down. 5 miles is the limit these people can manage. Why you don't know that? She waved her arm back across the caravan. They won't last another 3 hours in this weather without losing someone. There is a good chance we have already lost some. Torin responded to her in a tone of voice that seemed dispassionate. It was somewhat jarring to see him seemingly care so little about the loss of life and incensed the woman further. Besides, who is it that will not last another 3 hours? Them or you? Olga bristled at the insinuation. Both. Really? Torin sounded dubious. These men have faced worse winters than this and have lived through them. I am confident they can make it through this one as well. He paused before he looked over his shoulder. Besides, I have little interest in leading them to their deaths. I had wanted to travel through the storm for its entirety, but that seems foolhardy. It's foolish not to make camp now. We're too close. Torin bluntly stated. Even 5 miles is a close distance, but the storm is removing all options and the hope that it shall lessen has not sprouted. Therefore we shall journey as far as we can before making camp. He turned back around. If your legs can carry you no further, then I am sure one of your servants can sling you over their shoulder. Olga bit back another retort. Instead she glared ahead of the group and resumed pushing herself through the snow to the best of her abilities. It was going to be a long 3 hours, she could already tell that much. Snow crunched under hoof as the black armored servant approached the outskirts of the abandoned settlement. The horse neighed beneath the rider. Glowing red eyes shifted as the knight pulled on the reins and twisted the direction the mount was facing until it was side on. The horned helm shaped in the head of a black dragon slowly moved from left to right as the individual underneath the armor examined the town. Eventually, their head moved towards what would be the entrance to the settlement and cracked their reins once again. The armored horse sauntered forwards at a steady pace before being pulled to a halt. Even with the storm covering most of it, there were still faint traces of it. The snow was slightly disheveled, as if something had been dragged through it before the storm had truly picked up and it hadn't yet been buried. The helmet slowly turned away from the settlement, following the faint groove carved out in the snow and watching as it got further and further away from the town and into the distance. Behind the maw of the helm, pale yellow eyes narrowed before the figure twisted the reins once again and resumed their march. Moving in the same direction that the faint tracks were heading, even if they lost them through the course of the journey it likely wouldn't matter much. They were traveling with the total population of an entire town and through a rough storm. If it was a small group, then making doubling backtracks and twists and turns would be more accessible to them. However, that wouldn't be the case. Doing such maneuvers would only serve to put the citizens they were trying to protect in danger. It was a smart move at the very least to try and escape under the cover of dark and in the middle of the storm. There was just one issue. It made them slow. Slow prey was easy to catch, and whatever guardians they had, likely one or more servants, would never try to abandon the defenseless people, which meant they would be forced to face her and the small force of dragonkind she was bringing with her. A shadow passed above her head, just barely casting a black patch across the ground as it moved through the sky. The dull red dragon continued to move through the storm without giving the slightest indication it was affected in the least. Snow melted upon contact with the giant lizard, with a great many of the wyverns sticking close to their larger cousin in order to push through the storm. Go, Yamre! With a click of the reins and a cold voice barely above a whisper, the horse spurred into action, kicking off the snow with such force that it produced a small boom and sent an avalanche flooding back into the town. The mount rushed across the tundra without so much as showing the slightest hint of being affected by the thick snow as it plowed through it. Such was the speed that the beast was able to keep pace with the dragons flying overhead and soon passed by them. All the while, the lancer atop the intimidating mount remained silent, their eyes fixed ahead of them and staring into the blizzard. Olga was truly hating their current predicament. Moving had long since become a chore to her, and she knew that if she spoke up about it, that servant in front of her would probably give her some sort of comment about how that was expected of her. As if falling short behind all others was just what he thought she was all about. Therefore, she forced herself forwards even past what she imagined was her limits. She would likely suffer for it later, but as long as she avoided seeing that mocking expression she knew that servant would be making behind his helmet when he saw her fall, then it would be acceptable. Something rested itself on her back. It was small, somewhat thin, but stretched out across the back of her coat like some sort of branch. Gah! Releasing a panicked gasp, she whirled around to stare into the blizzard, soon finding her vision almost completely obscured by Nero's grinning face. The green-eyed emperor gazed directly into the goggles as though they didn't exist and instantly locked eyes with the director. Pale rose. Nero patted her several more times on the shoulder before she retracted the arm and allowed it to fall back underneath the cloak wrapped around her. "I am pleased to see that you are still managing to navigate such conditions," she praised before flicking her hair back and removing a large chunk of snow from it, the smile shifting into a slightly annoyed pout. "All this snow is causing a great deal of discomfort for my hair." Olga just stared at her incomprehensibly for a few moments, then shook her head and frowned at the woman behind her mask. "What on earth are you? Look at it." Nero raised up her right hand and ran it through her blonde locks, displacing yet more snow from her head, which quickly found itself replaced in the storm. The emperor shook her head. "I admit some envy, pale rose. Perhaps I shall invest in a coat or hood during future situations such as these." The woman continued on, cupping her chin and giving a thoughtful hum. "It might be wrong to conceal my beauty, but it is better to protect it for later than to risk its destruction now, isn't it?" "What are you doing here?" I got bored," Nero explained with a nod of the head, raising her voice just enough that Olga could hear her. "There is no one around to engage in conversation with and the caster seemed terribly dull." She paused for a moment. "Well, perhaps not as such, but I merely suspect there is little we can speak about." "And so you came here?" Olga repeated in an incredulous tone of voice before clicking her tone. "If you're just coming to waste time, then you can. You do not agree with this plan, do you?" The way in which Nero's voice shifted from jovial to almost serious was jarring, so much so that Olga almost missed a step as she whirled back on the emperor. "I did not need to hear your conversation to see such things," the emperor explained with a wave of her left hand. "It is all about your posture." She reached out with the arm and tapped Olga's tightly bunched shoulders and her crossed arms. Stop touching me," Olga snapped as she drew herself away, stumbling slightly in the snow and forcing Nero to grab her arm to steady her. "Fine." She growled under her breath and looked ahead, making sure to slow her pace so she wasn't too close to Torin. "I don't like the plan." Nero nodded along with her. "There are many times that I did acts that I did not personally enjoy," she explained in a serious tone as she nodded her head, not even reacting to the falling snow and her eyes becoming distant. "Leadership isn't always about pleasing everyone, and there is not one in all of history that is loved universally." She chuckled. "It is embarrassing for me to admit that, given how hard I tried, but I am an example of this too. What's the point of being a leader if everyone is dead by the end of it?" Olga huffed and looked on ahead, not shifting her posture. "You are speaking to an emperor, Consul Animosphere," Nero pointed out with a small huff. "Do not forget that so swiftly, though with how brightly I burn, it might be easy to think of me as an idol and not a leader of an empire." Olga remained silent before she clicked her tongue. Times were different. We aren't living in the Roman Empire anymore. Humanity has moved past that. Nero hummed to herself. "Perhaps, but the eternal empire burns in all hearts." She spoke in an almost amused tone of voice. "That longing dream to expand as far as you can, to see all there is to see and to experience everything. So long as that dream resides in the hearts of men, women and children, then Rome shall never truly fade away." "That's just describing motivating factors for advancing humanity," Olga grumbled with an irritated tone. "What does that have to do with making bad decisions?" "Is it a bad decision?" Nero asked, "or is it one you do not like?" Quote. Olga grit her teeth and avoided looking at the emperor from the corner of her eye. "They aren't mutually exclusive." "Perhaps," Nero conceded, "but in this case, I admit that I do not see another solution. We would have been forced to depart the village regardless if we hope to resolve the singularity, and this way we also find allies who are willing to aid us in future battles." The emperor gestured ahead of them to the shadow of Torin. "I know that," Olga snapped, whirling on the emperor and glaring at her. "I know we get allies, but that doesn't." She paused and looked back away. "That isn't. It shouldn't come from such things. The sacrifice of innocent lives just so they could get some help didn't change that. It was the perfect sort of logic that should be used by a director." Sacrifice the lives of the citizens to gain the power of servants and then save thousands more when the singularity was resolved. That sort of thing was easy to explain. It was easy to write down. It wasn't easy to do. That was how the demi-servant program was started. Despite all this, Consul Animosphere. Nero's voice attracted her attention once again. The director found herself more fatigued than anything else when speaking to her. That you show such care to people that you have never met in your life is astounding to me. The emperor gave her a half-smile. That is a good trait to have, especially for a leader. I would rather follow one who cares than one who does not. She didn't mean that. Olga's mind whispered the words to her, she's just saying that so you won't kick up a fuss again. It's just false platitudes and nothing more. She probably doesn't even respect you as a leader. Consul. What a joke. Olga turned away from the emperor, falling into a long silence and her posture making it perfectly clear that she wasn't willing to speak on the matter further. Nero nodded ever so slightly to herself and backed away, falling further and further down the line to where she had originally been. Nero might have told an ever so slight lie when she said that she had come to the director because she was bored. As she moved further down the line, she approached the individual she had been speaking with previously. Marie turned her head towards the emperor as she approached, her right hand pressed firmly upon the top of her hat to keep it atop her head. The queen's eyes squinted as the blonde servant approached her, raising her left hand and giving a wave of welcoming as she got closer and closer. How did it go? Marie called out as loud as she could as Nero closed in. The emperor paused for a moment as she considered how best to answer before she responded. I think it went quite well. Nero replied with a slight hint of pride in her voice. I would say that Pale Rose is on the road of understanding how best to handle the situation. There was a pause as she frowned. I think, the head coverings make it remarkably difficult to actually tell what she is thinking. Even her posture can only tell me so much and I am no true master at reading such things. Marie gave a hum as she nodded her head along with the emperor. I see. She responded in a quiet tone that was almost lost in the winds, turning to the left and smiling as she stared at the carriage riding alongside them. She could spot a small red-haired child sticking his head up against the window of the glass and cupping either side of his head to try and look through it. Nero turned to where she was looking and snorted at the sight. I see that the young ones have already grown rather attached to the transport, have they not? Marie giggled. I'm quite pleased at that. Hearing the sounds of laughing children is a rather pleasant thing, isn't it? She turned back to Nero and put on a more concerned expression. So you think she might be getting better? Nero thinned her lips at that. Though I call it progress, I cannot be sure. I believe she might take the worst meaning from my words and she made no effort to hide her dislike of the plan. She fell into step with the rider, looking ahead and strutting through the snow while dragging the cape behind them. I confess my own misgivings of such a treacherous voyage, but there is little choice, is there? The French queen gave a slight hum of acknowledgement. Torin explained as such. I feel as though that the young lady dislikes being told what is and is not possible for her to accomplish. Perhaps, Nero admitted, scratching her chin. I have met quite a few in my time as emperor, those who did not like to be told what was impossible for them to accomplish. However, I feel as though perhaps Pale Rose might care a great deal even if she does not show it terribly well. She turned back to Marie, considering she seemed to demonstrate quite a large amount of concern for the people we are escorting. Giving another hum, Marie looked on ahead and thinned her lips. How do you think it will go if we actually fight? Ah. Nero made a noise. I'm sure it will go fine. She dismissed with a wave of her hand, smiling as she did so. We have other servants to support us and the polite knight seems to have no real complaints when it comes to speaking with Pale Rose, despite how she seems to be somewhat harsh with him. I would call it rude. Marie bluntly stated, her face turning more troubled. Tarkus has been nothing but polite since we met him and she doesn't seem to recognize that. Honestly, I'm surprised how he might be a servant at all with how nice he is. She turned back to Nero and tilted her head. Can you see him using that large sword on his back to hurt anyone? That threw the emperor for a loop for a few moments as she considered the answer. Sure enough, it might be difficult to imagine some servants being capable of killing people. One could even make the same argument for the French queen if there was no prior evidence given during the French Singularity. Now, while Nero hadn't been personally there for that, she had heard of it as passing gossip from those who had actually gone to the Singularity. But on the topic of Tarkus, Nero found it surprisingly difficult to imagine him killing someone when he spoke so politely and appeared rather courteous to all he met. However, that could just as easily mean he was one who was polite and kind with his allies and brutal with his enemies. That wouldn't be too great a surprise to her, now that she considered it. Especially considering he was summoned as a saber. Normally such heroes were ones who demonstrated legendary feats with the sword and felled many foes on the fields of battle. She was obviously the exception because she was a magnificent emperor of Rome, and if she said she was a saber, then by Jupiter she was a saber. Perhaps. Nero admitted slowly as she nodded her head, he is still a servant. Mare remained silent for a moment before she made a noise of understanding. Ah, right. I feel silly asking about that now. She awkwardly reached up with her right hand and scratched the back of her neck. As she did so, a gust of wind blasted the hat from the top of her head. Marie let out a noise as she spun around and snatched it back down before it could get very far. B-rank agility was useful for things like that. Perhaps some straps, Nero suggested as Marie affixed the hat back onto the top of her head and adjusted it. The emperor pointed to her chin, something to tie it around your chin. Marie paused for a moment before shaking her head. I think it would look rather strange, almost like a crash helmet. She paused for a moment as she considered her words. I didn't even know what a crash helmet was before. Ah yes, modern terminology. Nero nodded along. It is rather difficult to understand at times, somewhat confusing. Really, I think it's neat. Marie giggled. You get me, fam. Nero stared at her. Huh. Marie's shoulders slumped in slight disappointment. Oh. Romani raised his hand over his mouth to block out the yawn that was emerging from his throat. The director wasn't the only one to be feeling the onset of tiredness, although the doctor was hardly going to be making that sort of comment right now. The fact they had been able to make such a journey was good enough, but back in the command center they had a better look of things than down on the ground. The results were somewhat grim to behold. That's another one. Maxwell closed his eyes, his voice leaving his mouth as toneless. That makes it 5 in the last hour. These guys are hardy sure, but it ain't like they're packing big snowcoats and thermal packs. Carrie remarked as she shook her head, grimacing. Still though, watching dots fade away on a screen is nasty. As long as we can help keep the others alive, then we can say this is a victory. Romani spoke up, although the words felt almost toxic in his mouth, even as he spoke them. From a purely pragmatic point of view it made sense, but these people shouldn't have been put into this position to begin with. None of this was supposed to happen, so all of those who died weren't supposed to meet with such fates. None of it was right, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. Sit at the town and wait to get swarmed by dragons, or venture out and brave the cold, losing a few to the storm. Romani exhaled as he reached up and ran his hands through his hair. Goodness knows what the director would be saying if she was here instead of down there, likely talking about unacceptable casualties. Lowering his hands onto the desk, he stared at the screen for what felt like hours, gazing at the 200 or so red dots moving across the computer landscape before he squinted his eyes and looked to what was approaching from north of them. He felt his skin turn ashen and his heart rate speed up. Is anyone else seeing this? He called out across the command room as he pressed the buttons on his keyboard and zoomed the monitor onto the new dots that showed up in the storm. Quote. Oh shit. Carrie was the first to speak up as she similarly brought up the results and subsequently blanched. A large magical energy signature, weaker than the one they had seen in France, but it still matched the basic structure. A dragon was closing in on the group, and from the looks of things, it was being accompanied by at least a dozen wyverns, perhaps more. They were so bunched around the larger beast it was difficult to make them out. Romani went to alert the director when he noticed something else on the screen. The magical output was easily large enough to match the dragon, but the makeup of it was all wrong. His eyes slowly widened. It wasn't a dragon, it was a servant that was accompanying the dragon and the wyverns. In essence, they were being pursued. Director. Olga winced as Romani practically screamed into the air, his voice rippling forth from the communicator on her wrist as little more than a shout. She barely even registered the high degree of panic attached to the voice as she raised up her wrist and stared at the communicator, watching as the screen popped up and revealed the doctor's face. Like his voice, he also looked on the verge of passing out from terror. You have to get ready for an attack. Romani called out frantically, you've got hostile signatures closing in on you. A dragon accompanied by a group of wyverns and a servant. Olga blanched. Wh. But you said that wyverns couldn't fly in this weather. She practically screeched out loud. The people next to her stopped walking and turned their heads in her direction. Torin from up ahead ceased walking and whirled around as a blur to stare at the group and swiftly marched back towards them. From the looks of things, they're sticking close to the dragon and using it as some sort of buffer. Romani explained, but they're coming on you fast, they should be on you within a few minutes. Torin remained silent before he looked up towards the sky, glaring at the darkened clouds and the snowstorm before his hands clenched themselves into fists. Reaching down to his waist, he clasped the rope tied around him and undid it from his person, dropping it to the snow and rolling his shoulders while bringing forth his axe. Then we shall have to delay them as long as we can. Why delay? Olga looked at him incredulously, not defeat. I am prepared for either outcome. Torin simply replied as he marched past her, a large double-sided axe in his hands brought into a ready position as he moved further and further down the line. Whatever happens, stay together. His voice roared out above the storm, likely being supported by his magical energy to penetrate the storm. If you run into the storm by yourself, then you are doomed. Olga grit her teeth and turned further down the line, then cupped her hands around her mouth in an effort to shout out, "All servants to the back." She sent a mental command to Stahl to move to the back of the group, briefly remembering he had been wounded and having him hand those off to others still moving, before she herself waddled through the snow as fast as she could. Not even close to being fast enough to keep pace with the taller knight, but she was at least making slow progress. A rumble split through the storm. For a moment Olga had thought it to be little more than thunder before the sound went on for longer than she was comfortable with. As it trailed off, she slowly turned her head skywards as she realized the thunder had gotten louder the longer it went on. She could see it in the distance, high into the sky. A faint orange glow, dancing through the sky as if it were a firefly amidst a raging hurricane. For a moment she considered it to have an eerie beauty to it, then she widened her eyes as she watched the glow get larger and larger, the mild light managing to do its job just enough to unveil the looming shadow just behind the burning glow. A pair of powerful wings beat up and down as the creature they belonged to was propelled forwards and at great speeds at the group. Olga released a strangled noise as she fell back, slumping into the snow and freezing on the spot. Doing nothing more than watching as the dragon got closer and closer to her, the bright glow at the forefront of the beast making much more sense now as it fell towards her. Slightly higher than the growing orb of fire in the gullet of the dragon were a pair of faint glowing eyes, an ethereal color of pure hazel that shone like jewels. That sheer power of the eyes locked onto her before being blotted out. Olga released another cry as a shadow fell over her and blocked out her line of sight with the dragon. A hulking mass stood protectively before her with the rounded scaled shield pointed skywards, an oversized axe held in the other hand, glowing menacingly as flickers of lightning danced across the blade. Another roar split through the sky, this time accompanied by the panicked screams of the caravan as they rushed to get away from the point where the dragon looked set to strafe them. Then it flew right above them, the maw opened up to its fullest extent and breathed out a river of flame across the ground, burning a thick line through the snow and sending a wall of fire into the air, stretching a good 3 meters and curving around the caravan before the dragon took back off into the sky with several more beats of its wings. The director raised her hand to protect herself from the sudden brightness. The newly birthed wall of flames granted her a sudden clarity of vision that made seeing a trivial matter. Lowering her hands, she found herself transfixed by the sight for a few moments. It didn't make sense to her in the least. The dragon flew right over them instead of burning them. Did it just not see them? Why burn a massive line of fire in front of them? It can't have been to block them off, because then they could just go around. Perhaps she had just been protected by the flames because of Berserker. Almost hesitantly, she turned back around to face the front and blinked. She could see the caravan easily enough, her own shadow being cast across them with no sign of any of them being caught in the flames. Her brows furrowed as she tried to get back to her feet. Why did it miss them? It didn't make sense. She could see the caravan was unharmed. So what was the point of that? Cu lowered his arm, staring down the length of the caravan. Crimson eyes widened in horror as he stared at the wall of fire that lay directly in their path. And to the black outlines of the people that were now cast across the fiery backdrop, showcasing where they all were. Oh, fuck. Cu quietly cursed to himself before he directed his attention skywards and narrowed his eyes at the storm. There was a faint silver lining though. It meant they could also see all the wyverns that were now swooping down upon them. With a wave of his hand, several bolts of lightning rushed forth from runes he carved in the air. The attacks crossed the distance of the sky in a heartbeat, striking the closest wyvern to him and causing it to release an ear-piercing scream of agony as the life was literally fried out of it, the beast tumbling through the air. Brown scales now scorched dark as it fell to the ground with little in the way of grace, slamming into the snow and rolling for several meters before coming to a halt. Wyverns in the sky, Cu called out, Runes raising his voice to ensure that everyone could hear him. No sense in worrying about stuff like keeping a low profile now when everything within a mile of them would be able to see the bonfire and their bodies moving in front of the flames. Eyes to the sky, he stopped and waved his hand once again, bringing forth another barrage of runes and striking another wyvern that sought to try its luck. The beast twisted in the air, avoiding the initial barrage and responding by hurling a bolt of flames towards him. The caster narrowed his eyes and twirled his staff before thrusting it forwards like a spear, slamming it directly into the center of the fireball and dissipating it as his eyes worked to reacquire his target. The fact he couldn't see the dragon that had caused this mess to begin with was already weighing on the back of his mind. It would be all too easy for it to make another pass at them from the air and unleash a river of flames on them. He could protect himself and a few others if that happened, but protecting the entire troop? Not a chance. Orbs of fire crashed into the center of the line. Bodies went flying in the blast and screams split through the air. Cu grit his teeth as he watched shadows dance across the sky. Wyverns zooming through the air and making continuous strafing runs towards them. A spear shot across the air, slamming directly into the skull of one of the wyverns. The force behind the throw was great enough that not only was the spear obliterated by it, but so was the skull and neck of the wyvern. Momentum carried it backwards, disappearing into the darkness of the storm as a bleeding ragdoll. Well, all right then. Wasting no further thoughts on it, Cu returned to what he was best at. Being a guard dog, even if he would never publicly say that. All those with bows, take aim to the skies and loose true and firm. Torin's voice roared across the length of the caravan, all the way to the back where Cu was located. The caster shifted his attention towards the shout for a split moment before he shifted his attention back to combat. Tarkus grabbed another spear, drawing it back and staring at the sky with narrowed eyes. He was absolutely certain that the first throw against the small dragon had been nothing but luck, but that only meant that he was very lucky. Right now, as long as he was hitting something, then he was alright with that. The Black Knight drew back the spear as far as he could and slowed his breathing. His eyes flickered across the sky for any sign of movement. His eyes snapped left and his arm rocketed forwards. The spear launched itself across the sky with a boom. Snow parted the instant the spear took to the air, the wind curving around the weapon. It missed the wyvern by a good meter, but the winds that followed in its wake did their job and rocked the beast in the air. A screech emerged from the beast's throat as it flapped its wings repeatedly in an effort to stabilize itself. That made it a stationary target for a few moments, and being illuminated by the fires going across, that made it a very welcome target. Dozens of arrows crashed against it, bouncing from the scales with dull thuds. Save one, through either luck or skill the arrow slammed into the wyvern's left eye. The beast leaned back and roared in pain, the voice cracking slightly as it reached up towards the wounded eye with its legs in an effort to pull the arrow free. Ha! A cry shook the air. The form of Nero with a blazing sword in her hand swept across the darkened horizon and rushed straight towards the wyvern, approaching from its blind side and still put off by pain. It was left thoroughly unprepared for when the Emperor smashed her burning sword into its gut and tore it open. The beast fell from the sky in a show of blood soon after, Nero landing atop the ground, soon followed by the crunching thud of the wyvern corpse. The Emperor cast a stern visage, her expression illuminated by her sword and by the backdrop of the inferno ahead of them. "Stand firm," she cried out, raising her sword up once again and pointing it towards the heavens. "We still have foes to vanquish. Shall this be the place you meet your ends? I think not. What battle will lead you to glory if it is through an ambush by mere animals?" Perhaps her words would have been more impactful if the red dragon hadn't chosen that moment to burst through the clouds, soaring towards the group with its maw opened wide once again and the orange glow building in the back of its throat as it got closer and closer to the group, eager to make another pass on them. Nero turned to see what they were staring at and promptly blinked. Oh. Grabbing another spear, this time from someone's arm, he made sure to apologize to them. He drew it back and didn't wait for a chance to aim, hurling it with all his might with enough blowback to send the snow rolling behind him. The spear thudded against the front of the dragon with a crack. The beast flinched its head to the side but otherwise didn't look too gravely affected from the attack. Shifting to the shield on his back, Tarkus swung it around in front of him and then unsheathed the greatsword from its scabbard. The knight charged forwards like a lumbering wall of metal, bringing his shield up and waiting for the dragon to unleash its breath upon them. Another thud sounded out across the sky, this time accompanied by the sound of flesh being parted. The dragon let out a pained roar as the orange glow vanished from its mouth and it twisted midair, the gleam of a positively giant one-sided axe being reflected in the light caught Tarkus's eye as the beast flew over the top of the caravan and crashed into the ground, the axe having struck it directly on the joint between the left wing and the body. Despite the rough landing, the dragon was swift to get back upon its feet and whirl its enormous head in the direction the axe had come from, narrowing its glowing eyes towards the charging servant. Stahl moved with speed unexpected of something their size, raising their circular shield as the dragon opened up their mouth once again and allowed the flames to build up in the back of their throat. Before Tarkus could change directions, he stumbled back as something smacked into his back. The knight blinked and turned back around, seeing the ground around him slightly charred as though something had set fire to it. Turning his gaze upwards, he soon located the answer to that question as he watched a wyvern fly back away from him, its mouth glowing in an effort to appear intimidating as it prepared to launch another ball of flame. Ducking down low, Tarkus raised up his shield and allowed it to eat another orb of fire as he stabbed his greatsword into the ground and grabbed a clump of snow in his meaty palm. He then squeezed his hand as tight as he could, compacting the snow so far that it became like solid rock. As he revealed his makeshift projectile to the world, it had perfectly molded itself to his grip. The knight stood back up, pulling his arm back and hurling the snowball, now so dense it likely could have killed a normal human being, at the wyvern. The animal dodged to the right to avoid the ball of hardened snow. Tarkus made a small noise of disappointment as he watched his attack miss before he went to form another snowball. Olga had noticed the dragon rushing the center of the column and had immediately ordered Stahl to intercept it. While she hadn't been specific on the details, the last thing she had actually been expecting was for the berserker to hurl the axe at the beast. Still, it knocked the dragon out of the sky and therefore achieved the objective she had in mind, so it was fine in the end. Turning her head towards the combat, she watched as Stahl charged straight towards the dragon while raising their rounded shield. The berserker then kicked off the ground and launched themselves into the dragon's chin like a battering ram. The bottom jaw snapped up and collided with the top, shutting the mouth and causing the dragon to stagger backwards. Not that it remained on the defensive for long, bringing its full weight to bear, it brought its front right leg up and slammed it down into the ground with enough force to shake the earth. The fact that Olga felt her own legs shake the moment the dragon struck the ground was proof enough of just how much power it had put into the attack. Of course, that had nothing on the wave of snow that was kicked up by the attack. Stahl swung their shield to the side, creating a gust of wind that parted the sea of snow that had been rushing towards them. Then angled their shield slightly when the dragon's head fell upon them with their jaws wide open. The mouth had extended wide enough that it could take the width of the shield in its mouth easily and did just that, clamping down around the rim of the berserker's defensive armament and picking them up into the air. Olga was watching in silence as the dragon swung her servant around like a ragdoll, the berserker's armor making a grinding sound as parts and joints were slammed against one another. I'll let go of the shield," she called out in her head. The berserker complied with the order and released the shield in the middle of one of the dragon's swings. The end result was the servant being launched several dozen meters into the air before plummeting back to the ground with a heavy crash, burying themselves a good 4 feet in the snow and dirt. The dragon swung their head to the opposite side and released the shield, flinging it away like the world's largest discus and far into the distance before it turned its attention back onto the fallen dragon slayer, stalking forwards and raising up its foot with the sole intention of crushing the troublesome berserker. All the while, Olga just stared uncomprehendingly at the battle, blinking repeatedly as thoughts rushed through her mind. That wasn't supposed to happen. They were a dragon slayer. What type of dragon slayer couldn't slay dragons? "O tree, Gildru Oven Min!" A voice cried out. A rush of roots rushed up from beneath the snow and wrapped around the limbs of the dragon that still rested upon the ground. The dragon itself lurched forwards as it found its momentum briefly halted, turning its head and staring at the branches and roots now clinging to its body before releasing a snort of black smoke. With a grunt of exertion, the dragon pulled its whole body to the side and shattered the bindings that had it. "Do not dally," Torin all but ordered Olga as his form blurred past her, rushing the dragon and kicking up a wave of snow as he ran. "Order your servant to get up and retrieve their axe." Olga was briefly shook from her stupor as the words registered in her mind. "Get the axe back." Like that, Stahl was back on their feet as though nothing had happened to them at all. The berserker kicked off the ground, devoid of weapons, and leapt straight for the dragon's head. The red-scaled beast noticed the body of the berserker flying towards them a second too late as Stahl slammed into the side of their skull with a shoulder ram. The dragon staggered with the blow, Stahl reaching up and slamming their gauntlet down into the top of the dragon's ridge and clenching their hands with all the strength that they had. Armored fingers dug through scales and drew out blood from the insertion points. A scream erupted from the dragon and soon turned into a pained grunt as Stahl placed his feet against the dragon's jaw and kicked upwards. Stahl rolled across the top of the dragon, sliding down the back and reaching the midsection of the back where the wings lay. Finding their axe still embedded in the back of the dragon and taking a hold of it before ripping it clean out with no thought for delicacy, even taking a sizable chunk of dragon flesh with them as they did so and spraying blood across the snow. The dragon released another pained roar, then flinched back as Torin slammed his axe into one of its front toes just behind the front nail. The caster twisted the weapon and gripped a hold of it before yanking forwards, tearing the dark claw from the finger of the dragon and tossing it away without a care in the world. If his plan had been to anger the dragon, then it was a success beyond all doubts. The dragon's roars were nothing shy of rage incarnate, the very air bled with magical energy as the density surrounding the dragon hiked up. The director felt her breath start to shorten as her body reacted to the sudden influx. It was far more than modern mages were equipped to handle at such close range, and she could already feel her body's limits being reached. "Director," Romani frantically called through the radio, "you're suffering from mana oversaturation, you need to get out of there now." "Director." As if sensing their master's pain, Stahl's head snapped towards the woman instantly and then down to the dragon. Adjusting the axe in their hand, the berserker gripped it tightly with both hands before turning onto the right wing, which was still undamaged. With a silent roar, the berserker swung the axe down with all their might. Scales shattered, flesh parted and bones were shredded the moment the axe bit into the extra limb. Tearing halfway through and ensuring that for the time being, the dragon would not be flying. The roar cracked, the dragon's rage shifting into a howl of agony as it bucked and swung its body in an effort to fling the berserker from them. With a momentous effort from their body, they flexed themselves and swung their body down, rolling across the ground and roaring as their wings were pressed into the snow. Despite that, the dragon succeeded in forcing Stahl to leap from the body to avoid being crushed and for Torin to jump to the side for the same reason. As the dragon righted themselves, they brought their tail to bear in a sweeping motion, slicing it through the air towards the two servants in an effort to strike them. The back of the tail smashed against Stahl's head, flipping the servant onto its back and leaving it lying motionless on the ground. Torin was far luckier, having seen the move coming. Dropping down, he felt the tail sweep over his head as it carried forth a tsunami of snow which washed over his body. Shaking himself free of the cover, he rushed back to his feet and adjusted the axe in his hand as the dragon brought themselves to face him entirely, eyes narrowed and a deep menacing growling building up in the back of its throat. "O Lordkin of the forest, guide my axe," Torin chanted to himself before he stamped his foot down and raised his axe upwards, giving out a bellowing roar before he charged forwards at the dragon. Yamre slowed themselves to a halt. The rider of the mount stared out across the horizon towards the burning wall that lay in the distance and the shadows it cast from all those who stood before it. The rider gave a grunt as their eyes scanned the battlefield, tracking the wyverns descending upon the caravan one after another but very quickly losing numbers. They were mere fodder though, their role was to distract the opponents from the real threat. The dragon itself seemed to be under quite a great deal of pressure at the moment. Even from this distance the rider could tell they didn't have access to their wings. Unexpected resistance? Probably. The level of damage done when they weren't far behind, likely someone with a conceptual advantage against dragons. Given the nature of their allies, it was expected that someone who could fight dragons would have been summoned. Regardless, that just made their role all the simpler. Deal with those who represent a threat. That was what their master wanted, so that was what they were going to do. As they searched for servants to target, something caught their eye near the dragon. An individual standing just in front of the wall of flames. Narrowing their eyes, they took in the features of the individual. Garbed in clothes that couldn't have looked more out of place if they had tried, they stood out like a sore thumb even amongst the backdrop of fire. A unique individual surrounded by servants. A master perhaps. And one who didn't have a servant accompanying them. They could be mistaken, but it was something they were not going to risk. The spear in their hand was raised, the elongated weapon of carved obsidian stone with red spiked gems jutting from its surface locked onto the individual and started to glow menacingly. Magical energy built up within the spear, far exceeding what any normal servant was capable of. She was no normal servant though. She was the king of the storms, and this was her element. And, yo, hey, Artoria Lancer Altar. What's that? You're getting an actual roll. Goodness me. Anyway, yes. First engagement. It's a frantic struggle already and the servant hasn't even fought yet, oh boy. So why is Olga bad? Simple. The Dragon Slayer armor is more like a sentient Balmung. They are a being that is proof a dragon slaying did occur, but whether it occurs again is dependent on the wielder. In this case, the wielder is Olga. Yeah, you have to think quickly in servant fights and not get distracted. Stahl just doesn't have that sort of mental capacity to make complex decisions for themselves. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 123, The Shield Maiden. Snow crunched under feet as the figure marched through the snow, ignoring all sense that there even was a storm raging around them as they did so. Even the frozen winds rushing over their face elicited barely a reaction from them. The figure marched ever onwards, their steps graceful as if in defiance of the storm. Movements that would usually have been clumsy in order to maintain some measure of stability were instead taken slowly and carefully, speaking of a great deal of experience in dealing with climates such as this. It was natural for them though, they knew these lands even if they had not walked them in many an age. These were the lands they were born in, lived in and died in. There was nothing about them that they could not possibly be prepared for, so there was no reason to be worried about a spot of mild weather. They had experienced worse, after all. Finally, the figure ceased walking through the snow and stopped movement altogether. Their eyes remained locked onto the distance, however they were not staring at anything in particular. In actuality, the pale-haired figure was attempting to hone their other senses through the storm to detect what she thought she had heard a moment ago. To the untrained eye, it would have sounded not so different from a clap of thunder, but to her the sound was something else entirely. It was the roar of a dragon, it could be nothing but. Though she had been summoned with little to no information as to whatever threatened this land, she understood that there was a threat to it regardless. Something was threatening her homeland, and if she had been summoned here, then there was a good chance that he had been summoned here as well. And if that was the case and she was hearing a dragon, then there was a very real chance that he was present there already. Doing what he did best, slay the great beasts. There was no chance he wouldn't be doing so, that was just what he was like. Always doing heroic deeds. Her beloved. It was for those reasons that she loved him. And for those reasons she would kill him. Her head shifted ever so slightly to the right, immediately taking notice of a faint flicker of light in the horizon growing ever so slightly, stretching into the sky like a beacon. Violet-colored orbs narrowed ever so slightly to focus on the orange glow in the distance. Her vision was enhanced by the language of the All-Father to see with absolute clarity the roaring inferno in the distance burning through the storm. Her body twisted in the direction of the flames. It was at least a mile from her, but she would make it there relatively swiftly. Adjusting her posture, she leaned forwards before kicking herself off into a run. Spear manifesting in her hand with her armored fingers clasping around it, the heart-shaped spear IP made from violet-colored metal dragging through the snow and carving a faint groove behind her as she did so. Despite her speeds, she moved with clear grace and barely even seemed to touch the ground, looking from the outside as though her feet came within a scant few millimeters of touching the surface before she was propelled forwards once again. She was getting close now. She had to see him again, he had to have been summoned. With an almighty roar, the red dragon swung its head to the slide like a club. Torin raised the flat side of his axe up in the split second before it hit in an effort to try and take the blow as best he could. The moment the armored skull struck, his legs were swept out from underneath him and his bulky frame was sent rolling through the sky as though it was an empty set of clothes, the man giving out a grunting noise as he clumsily fell through the sky without any sense of direction before he crashed face first into the snow and rolled for several meters. Pulling his head free, he shook his helmet several times to dislodge the snow that had gotten buried inside the eyeports of his helm. Using the butt of his axe, he slammed it into the ground and used it to push himself up and back onto his feet before he turned around to face the dragon once again. The beast wasn't looking at him this time, its attention was back onto the odd servant nearly twice his height and currently attempting to tear them in half with its jaws. continuously snapping at them as they chased the berserker around. With another snap of the jaws, the servant stepped back before it gripped the axe with both hands and swung it upwards like a club. The weapon cracked against the jaw of the dragon and staggered it back with the blow. Flakes of scale were sent flying from the impact site as the berserker advanced. It was a premature move. The dragon might have been stunned by the attack, but it wasn't left immobilized by it. Drawing its front leg off the ground, it curled the limb into its chest before sweeping it outwards in a backhanded motion. The attack slammed straight into the chest of the berserker and sent them flying away from the beast while giving off a heavy clunk, both as the attack landed and as the servant crashed into the ground in an explosion of snow. Torin grit his teeth and risked a brief glance towards the pale-haired girl who was supposed to be commanding her subordinates. She appeared to be just standing there in a trance, still staring at the dragon even as it turned its gaze towards her and released a threatening growl. That seemed to jolt her out of her statuesque state, although it was perhaps in the worst way possible considering she released a high-pitched scream and scrambled backwards, falling back into the snow. Releasing a sigh of annoyance, Torin rushed forwards while giving a bellowing warcry as he did so. Even if it physically did nothing for him, he knew that if the woman died then there would truly be no hope for any of them in surviving this fight. Whether she knew it or not, she was now one of the most important people here. His roar reached the dragon, the beast shifting its attention towards him and opening its maw up to reveal the back of its throat starting to glow. Twirling the axe in his hands, he aimed the blades of the weapon directly downwards before thrusting the weapon into the ground, parting the snow directly at his feet and into the ground beneath it. There was a pause before a rumble echoed out. With another grunt, Torin pushed the axe further down and twisted it. The ground trembled beneath him, then groaned as it shuddered and churned. The soil parted and rolled as it spread across the ground. The snow split open and fell into the newly formed crevices rushing across the ground towards the dragon. The beast stumbled to the left slightly as a crevice in the ground just large enough for its foot to get caught and opened up without warning. The orange glow cut out and the dragon looked down in confusion for a split second. That distraction was more than enough time for him, kicking off the ground into a sprint once again. Torin charged forwards and rolled underneath the front of the dragon and spinning around. Gripping his axe tightly, he swung up as hard as he could and buried the weapon at least 2 inches into the front of the beast. A brief grunt from the dragon showed it at least acknowledged the attack as it stepped back to unveil the druid to the world once again and let it spot him. Torin ripped the axe clean before spotting another area he could attack. Spinning around, he swung the axe into the back of the front right limb and once again scoring a nasty gash in the limb. However, he lacked the edge and raw power that the other servant seemed to possess, and his axe was rather mundane. Perhaps that was the difference between something wielded by a true dragon slayer, and a weapon wielded by someone who was only known as an enemy to a specific dragon. As he pulled the axe free, something slammed into his back and staggered him forwards. Torin released a gasp of surprise as something clawed at his waist from behind him and a pair of jaws snapped down around his left shoulder and punctured through his chainmail. The druid released a growl as he looked to the side, spotting a black-scaled wyvern locked onto him, likely having flown in from behind him and underneath the larger dragon. With a roar of his own, Torin pawned his axe off into his left hand and swung his right fist up, slamming his fist into the snout of the drake and prying it from his body. As it recoiled and loosened its grasp on him, the man dissipated his axe and brought up his left hand to grab the next while his right clasped around the upper jaw. Grunting, he flipped the drake over his shoulder and onto its back before he raised up his right leg and stomped down on the throat. The scales around its neck imploded inwards as his boot crushed the windpipe of the beast, bringing his axe back into existence. Torin turned around just in time to get a rush of cold air as the red dragon finally stepped back and stopped blocking him from the storm. Torin simply stared up in silence before he made an annoyed noise. A ball of luminescent pink light streaked across the sky before slamming into the side of the dragon's head. Though it gave no indication that it was caused pain by this attack, it did serve to gain its attention for a few short seconds, shifting its head in the direction the orb had came for before obviously spying the one who had attacked it. The berserker was back again, running forwards and slamming its axe into the exposed ribs of the dragon. The heavy thudding noise of the axe-shattering scales split through the storm, soon followed by the sound of the dragon crying in pain before once again swatting away the berserker. Torin was now beginning to feel that the servants spent more time getting knocked out of commission than they did actually doing any fighting. While their attacks were powerful, they were thus far few and far between to prove to be any sort of benefit. At the very least, the dragon couldn't fly, but it didn't need to do so in order to kill them all here. Another ball of pink light struck the dragon in the face. The head of the dragon flinched ever so slightly in response. In much the same way a person would when they were struck by a leaf in the middle of a storm, something to elicit a reaction but hardly something to be overly concerned about at the end of the day. Attacking a dragon with pure magical energy was never going to work. These beasts could exert force equal to that just by existing. Ha! Tarkus released a cry of exertion as he slammed the wyvern into the ground, grabbing it by the tail and pulling it back into the air before he started to twirl his body. Spinning around faster and faster until both he and the wyvern in his grasp were moving as little more than blurs to the naked eye. There was a brief pause before Tarkus felt a jerk run through his arms, then there was a snapping noise followed by a sound similar to meat being dropped on the floor before he found himself suddenly lurching to the side as he found he lost his counterbalance. The knight staggered forwards then fell face first into the snow. He could still feel his head rolling as he stared down, resting his hands either side of him and pushing up. His eyes slowly trailed to his right hand, finding himself staring at the contents in his palm with now small amount of surprise. He was still holding the tail of the wyvern in his hand, the detached limb wriggling around freely in the snow with an occasional twitch. With a noise of disgust, Tarkus let go of the limb and rushed back to his feet, a little too quickly as he once again found himself staggering around as his vision was still very much hazy from all the spinning. Shifting his vision to the loudest noises, he managed to catch sight of flashes of bright pink light streaking across the sky and slamming into the form of the red-scaled dragon, highlighting its form to everyone around, even more so than the wall of flame had achieved. However, that was all it seemed to be doing at the time. Shaking his head several times, Tarkus grabbed his greatsword from off his back held it before him with two hands, stalking towards the dragon with heavy steps. The hairs on the back of his neck rose, his helm slowly shifted to the right as he managed to feel a slight disturbance in the air. Perhaps disturbance was the wrong word to use, what he was feeling was nothing shy of death rushing towards him. He found his eyes locked onto something in the distance, an ever so slight flicker of crimson light that was seemingly suspended in the air, just beyond the end of the caravan and barely visible through the storm, even with the flames illuminating everything. He found himself almost transfixed by the sight, tilting his head ever so slightly as he continued to stare at it. Noticing that it seemed to be growing brighter and brighter the longer that he continued to look at it, although it was slightly off-center to him. With a curious hum, Tarkus continued to gaze at the light and seemingly forgot the battle that was currently raging around him as a result. The strange thing was that he was feeling that odd sense of dread from the direction of the light, but he couldn't quite figure out why that was. He looked over his shoulder, spying towards the front of the caravan and spotting Olga virtually undefended. Then turned back around to look at the light again. Ha! Tarkus made a sudden shout of panic as he jumped back, his sword dismissed as he brought forth his tower shield and raised it up, placing himself directly between the crimson light in the distance and Olga as he started to run backwards, intent on acting as some sort of defense, still unaware of what the light was or why he was feeling this level of. The light accelerated towards him, carving upwards as a beam of light through the snow and slamming directly into the front of his shield. Tarkus threw himself forwards, bracing against the attack and angling himself to hold his ground even as the force behind the beam of light combated against him. Gritting his teeth, Tarkus felt his feet start to slip backwards as he was pushed by the beam. Then came the explosions. The snow the beam had carved through detonated a split second later. Bright red flames rushed into the sky as the shockwaves sent the men flying away from the attack and into the snow. Tarkus himself felt the explosion wash over him and was launched back, crashing into the ground with a grunt as the beam died out. Coughing heavily, Tarkus blearily looked up from the ground and noticed the faint red light start to pick up again, even as the blood-red flames died down in the snow and the others attempted to pick themselves up. What in the? Nero's voice rang out, the Emperor sliding to a halt next to the downed body of Tarkus as she noticed where he had been knocked to the ground. What was that? Make sure Miss Animasphere is safe. Tarkus all but called out as he rolled back to his feet with a grunt, pulling his great shield up and staring at the large scorch mark running across the surface of it. Shaking his head, he pulled his great sword back out and rested it on his shoulder. I'm going to fight the red light. Nero blinked at him, but Tarkus didn't give her an opportunity to respond to him, already breaking into a heavy sprint as he moved across the snow tundra and charging off into the distance where he had spotted the light originating from. Nero herself didn't have much she could complain about. Making sure their master was safe was the priority of any servant, and while Nero was technically a servant on loan, that didn't make her responsibilities any lesser as a result. With a nod in Tarkus' direction, she turned around and rushed towards the form of Olga as she lay in the snow, staring in her direction, likely from hearing the roar that had been the unknown attack, with her hood blown back. Pale Rose. Nero called out as she rushed towards her, I suggest we find cover. I believe we are being attacked by more than drag. The Emperor slid to a halt and turned, raising up the flat of her sword and blocking a bolt of fire launched by a strafing wyvern as it passed overhead. Lowering the weapon, the Emperor scowled at the sky, I believe it unfortunate we do not have any archers available to us. Olga was still staring at her in silence, her expression mostly hidden behind the goggles and the scarf, but if the shaking was any indication, she wasn't doing quite so well. Come, Pale Rose. Nero rushed back towards her, grabbing her shoulder and quickly hauling the woman to her feet, we must find you cover before. A roar sounded out behind her, the Emperor turned around to see the dragon shift its head to the side, snapping its jaws at Marie as she galloped past atop a crystal horse, blowing bright pink light from the oversized ring on her right hand directly into the face of the beast. The dragon appeared to be more annoyed than harmed at the attack, although it shifted targets once again when Torin charged towards it and shouted something out in his strange language. The ground split open as roots rushed up and wrapped themselves around the jaws of the red beast, snapping them shut and locking them closed. The dragon released a muffled yell as it ripped its head back, shattering the roots, and then swung its head around as it tried to open up its jaw yet again. Aim for the legs. Torin yelled out as he charged the beast once again, the legs. The legs, Olga whispered to herself, the legs, yes, the legs. Nero gave her an odd look for a few moments before she heard the metallic rumbling noise that could only belong to a certain golem servant making a charge. Sure enough, Stahl was next seen sprinting towards the back leg of the dragon with an axe in hand before sweeping it up and into the joint at the front of the knee. The eyes of the dragon burned bright with pain as it shifted its whole body to the side to try and get its head around to bear on the berserker. Stahl ripped the axe free of the joint with a sickening squelch as they turned around, only to get headbutted into the ground by the massive skull of the dragon. Even being unable to open its jaw, that didn't stop the phantasmal from using its excessive weight like a hammer, raising its head up and then slamming it down atop the berserker as if driving in a nail. The end result was Stahl being buried even further in the ground. As it brought its head up again, Marie galloped past and hurled another ball of light direction into the side of their head. The attack caused it to pause briefly as it cringed in response to the blast. Shaking their head, they then followed the path of the rider as she galloped around it. The dragon narrowed its eyes, then drew more magical energy into itself. Power flooded every muscle of the dragon, including those within its jaws. The roots that bound its mouth shut started to creak and crack as the dragon started to force its maw open inch by inch, breaking through the bindings with a snapping sound each time. Torin slammed an axe into its chest for its troubles. That keeps happening, Olga whispered behind Nero as the Emperor led her further towards the caravan and out of the open. Why does that keep happening? She continually muttered to herself, the Emperor sitting her down and turning her eyes skywards again. I do not know what you mean, Pale Rose, but you should keep yourself alert. There are still plenty of foes about and we lack the means to combat them effectively. The Emperor paused for a moment, unless, she turned towards the caravan, someone find me a bow and some arrows. This is a fine fucking mess. Cu cursed to himself as he hurled another dozen runes into the sky, lighting up numerous shadows of wyverns circling above them through the storm for a brief moment before the flames faded away. That was excluding the dragon that fell on their heads and whoever was throwing that much magical energy at them. Quite frankly, they were in a shit position as was, and there was very little he could actually do about that right now. He had his hands full trying to keep those wyverns from falling on the people behind him without having to worry about a servant. Take the elderly and the sick to the center. A voice called out behind him, Brynjar, if he remembered right, and sure enough, that was followed by muffled shouts, warriors to the lines. Hold the beasts back. It was a nice sentiment, but a lot of these guys would be lucky to take out a wyvern by themselves. This many was just overkill, still it wasn't like they had much choice in the matter. He spied the red light begin to fade into existence once again, he grit his teeth. The last time he spotted that damn thing, it managed to burn an entire groove through the right flank and all but confirmed that a direct hit would probably do a number on a servant, let alone what it would do for the ordinary people they were traveling with. At the very least, he could try and attract its attention away from whatever it had been shooting at last time, or bring it forwards. With a wave of his hands, Cu cast several runes in front of him and launched them towards the red light. The balls of flame traveled the distance towards whomever the attacker was and seemingly scored a direct hit. Then he noticed the way in which the explosion of fire had warped around in a circle, shifting itself to accommodate whatever it had run into which had blocked its path. As the flames died down, he found himself staring at the shape of an armored rider mounted atop a rather mean-looking horse, their person illuminated by the remains of his attack burning beneath their feet and the crooked spear they held in their grasp. The servants slowly turned their head in his direction, then jerked the reins of their mount to face him. "Oh shit." Cu quietly cursed to himself as he twirled his staff and faced the person, gritting his teeth and watching as the pitch-black spear with bright red spikes jutting from it was pointed in his direction and started to glow with clearly menacing intent. Why did he always have to run into servants with magic resistance? That just wasn't right. "Thanks, Mr. Cu." The man almost choked in surprise at the voice before something rushed past his head and struck the helm of the knight with enough force that the rider of the mount actually recoiled slightly. Although he couldn't hear over the storm, he was sure there had been a thudding noise from the impact. What the? Cu turned to see who had thanked him, only to blink when he saw the Black Knight from earlier pull his arm back from being outstretched and grab his sword from out of the ground. Did you just throw a snowball at them?" "I did," Tarkus replied with a rather happy-go-lucky tone of voice as he rushed forwards, charging in the direction of the mounted knight without a hint of fear. "I'll take care of them, Mr. Cu. Thanks for letting me see where they were. I was just following the red light." "Yeah, that's the probable, never mind." Cu shook his head and turned back to deal with the wyverns. The sooner he could deal with those, then the faster they could work on the dragon and then the servant who was attacking them. So no big problem. Torin sailed over the head of Nero. The Emperor ducked down and watched as the man smashed into the snow with a tremendous explosion. Not that the knight remained down for long. It was a testament to his endurance that even after getting struck in the chest by a dragon tail that had been moving at speeds powerful enough to require her to solidify her footing, that he wasn't crippled by it. Or he had been and was just skilled at not showing pain in the face of tremendous injuries. Either way, the druid was back on his feet in moments and brandishing his bronze axe once again before rushing towards the direction of the Emperor, briefly taking notice of her with a bow in her hand and burning sword planted in the ground. "What? Imperial privilege?" Nero cheered as if that explained everything, holding her arrow tip into the odd flames off her still burning sword and pulling it out. The strange fire now clinging to the end of her projectile as she aimed up towards the moving shadows in the sky. "If I can be a swordswoman, why can I not be a bow woman?" Torin just shook his head at her and turned to face Olga, still crouched on the ground near him, giving her a frown behind his helmet before he stared back off in the direction of the dragon as it tried to snap its jaws on the queen riding around it. Clicking his tongue, he grabbed the master by the shoulder and hauled her up. Hey, what are? Torin pointed in the direction of the dragon. "I care not what issue your servant has. Have them fight the beast rather than being pummeled by it." "I'm trying," Olga shouted back, her voice teetering on being frantic. "It's not working, they just do what I say and then stop." Torin just did a double take at her, then keep giving it orders. He released her and rushed back off, charging in the direction of the dragon as fast as he could and leaving the two behind as he did so. Nero loosened an arrow into the sky, beaming as she was rewarded with a pained reptilian cry before she turned back to Olga. "I confess he speaks truly, Pale Rose. Perhaps the golem needs more specific commands." With that said, she returned to lighting her arrows ablaze and sending them skywards. Olga internally frowned. Specific commands. They were a golem that was supposed to. They were a golem. Golems only did what they were commanded to do. Which meant she would keep having to give commands to stall in order for him to actually be successful. Vague commands such as attack wouldn't cut it. She was instead stuck with the type of subordinate that needed to be told what to do at every single instance and demand her entire attention. That was just as bad as a servant that had a massive ego and needed to be constantly reined in. Gritting her teeth, Olga turned back to face the dragon and issued her commands. "Cripple the legs, avoid counter-attacks from the dragon," she commanded. The servant rose back up from the snow and hefted its axe up once again. "Bring your shield back to you." She noticed the servant then turned in the direction the dragon had thrown it and started to move. "Get it back via your weapon link," she hastily added on when she realized that the servant fully intended to just walk away from the battle and dig through the snow in the hope they would rediscover the shield that had been flung away into the distance. The servant paused, then remained standing for several seconds. Their left hand clenched and the circular shield found itself back in their grasp. The order completed, the servant defaulted back to the initial command and turned back around to face the dragon before breaking off into another sprint towards the beast. The axe was brandished and cracked with golden lightning while the shield was raised up to defend itself in the event of an attack being aimed towards it. The dragon heard the stomping sounds of the suit of armor approaching once again, shifting its attention away from Marie and back onto the armor with no small degree of rage. Then it did something unexpected, it charged forwards. Kicking off the ground, it rushed towards the suit with its jaw extended wide in an effort to grab hold of it. "Block it," Olga commanded in a panic, realizing seconds later that there was no way the servant was ever going to. The dragon halted, eyes wide and jaw still agape. Two large metallic hands gripped each of its jaws and held them open. The dragon attempted to pull back and found itself unable to, the dragon slayer armor having dropped its weapons and grabbing the open mouth with its limbs and holding it in place, straining against the strength of the beast with its own as the two fought. The dragon then attempted to raise its head. Keep it there," Olga called out when she got past her initial surprise. Stahl did just that, grasping even tighter around the jaws of the dragon and crunching the scales beneath their grip as they did so. Stopping the dragon from even so much as being able to move their next into the sky and instead being locked in place as the berserker tightly held their head in their massive hands. A faint orange glow built up in the back of the dragon's throat, the beast clearly preparing itself to unleash a blast of fire from its maw and vaporize the berserker if it could in an effort to release itself. There was more than just the berserker that would be caught in the attack though. The flames would no doubt wash through the servant and obliterate the front half of the caravan, and that would be if it caught them with a low-powered blast. "Close its mouth," Olga screamed out loud in a panic, briefly startling Nero and causing her to loosen her next arrow slightly early and send it flying off into the sky without hitting anything. The Emperor made a noise of annoyance before she grabbed another one. With a grunt, Stahl brought the two jaws together like a pair of scissors and snapped them shut and kept them shut. All the while the dragon's eyes widened in surprise and alarm as its struggle to free itself continued, all the while it was being pelted by blasts from Marie across its body, the continuous attacks from the rider slowly whittling away at the exterior of the dragon. With a muffled roar, the dragon shifted its body to the side while pushing with its powerful legs. Stahl maintained their grip, with the end result being the berserker's feet being dragged through the snow and carving a groove through the ground beneath them as it did so. Maintaining their grip, Stahl was focused solely on that simple command of keeping the dragon's jaws closed, and it was going to do just that. "This is going well then," Nero exclaimed as she loosened another arrow skywards. The wyvern numbers were gradually starting to thin down. "Ah." She looked to the side as she watched one of the warriors get grabbed by the flying beast and carted off away into the storm. Before Nero even had a chance to turn the bow on the wyvern, it had already taken both itself and its victim into the storm and out of sight. She grimaced and shifted her attention back to the dragon. "We should find a way to advance, Pale Rose. And how are you going to manage that?" Olga couldn't help but snap back at her. "We'd need to reverse and get around the wall of fire, but with the dragon still there and the wyverns in the sky we'd end up." A hissing sound to her left had her raise up arms to cover her face while the wall of dragon fire flickered. A large section in the center of the flames was smothered as a small tsunami of steaming water rushed through it, the boiling liquid spilling across the snow and melting to reveal the thick mud beneath it. Both Nero and Olga turned their sights on the figure that stepped through the gap in the flames. A white-haired woman with violet-colored eyes stared back at them. Both her arms had deep purple-colored metal gauntlets, with her left arm having a protective bracer around her upper bicep as well. Matching the arm design, her legs were covered in decorated violet-colored armor as well, however, as if to contrast that, her actual outfit was a black dress with a pale pink-colored metal corset around her waist. In her hands she brandished a long spear with a heart-shaped point at the end of it. The woman stared at the group as she continued to walk forwards, then gazed past them towards the dumbfounded expressions on the people at the front of the caravan, all of whom were caught between admiring her beauty and remaining alert for potential wyvern attacks while they were distracted. As she stared at the group, her eyes flickered across the faces of Nero and Olga before evident disappointment flashed through them for a split second, then turning in the direction they heard the combat of the dragon. Hope filled their features before that dwindled away as they beheld little more than a gang of servants dogpiling the beast. "Servant," Nero called out, stepping protectively in front of Olga and ripping her red sword from the ground and leveling it at the new arrival, her face set in a pensive frown. The white-haired servant shifted her attention back to the Emperor as she called out, You arrive at a troubling time, are you enemy or ally? There was no reply for a few moments before the woman's eyes flickered past Nero onto Olga and narrowed ever so slightly before they returned to their usual expressionless stare as they returned to the Emperor. I seek someone who is not here. The woman called out to them, her voice gentle but even still it carried over the rushing storm with little trouble. However, in his absence I shall provide aid. She paused for a moment as she turned her body to face the dragon and twirled the spear in her hands. Please, do not thank me for it. Neither Olga nor Nero could get out a response before the woman kicked off the ground with a sudden burst of speed and lunged directly towards the thick of the fighting. Greatsword met spear in a heavy clash of the two weapons. Tarkus struggled behind his helm to push the mounted knight down from their horse, locking his sword into the grooves between the red spines of the lance and the actual body of the weapon. The servant atop the menacing horse stared down at him in silence before shoving back with their weapon. Tarkus staggered with the blow before raising up his shield and grunting as the horse itself reared up and its hooves fell upon him like a hammer, crashing against his defense with a heavy crunch before it stepped backwards and freed him. Though he didn't lower his shield as the beast charged forwards, the rider thrusted their spear forwards as they passed by and struck the edge of the shield. Tarkus spun with the blow as the rider moved past him and forced him to track them as they did so. The Black Iron Knight maintained his focus on the horse and the rider as they banked left and made for another pass. The mount gave an intimidating grunt as it picked up speed and started to move faster and faster before it turned again and moved straight towards him. Tarkus raised his shield as the servant struck it once again, this time pushing him back through the snow as they sailed past. Tarkus lowered his shield again to reacquire them and found himself somewhat stunted when he couldn't actually see them. Even reaching out with his servant's senses didn't do much good. Being stood so close to the servant was like being in the center of a storm and trying to pick out an individual raindrop. The servant was so powerful that he couldn't help but sense them everywhere. A roaring gallop to his right had him whirl in the direction of the sound and raise his shield once again. This time the spear slammed into the upper section of the shield and jerked it back. The upper ridge of the tower shield cracked against his faceplate and staggered him back as the rider surged past him without losing momentum. The knight eventually stumbled to a halt, his head ringing from the impact before shaking it several times to straighten himself out. Shifting the shield to the side once again, he strained his ears to listen closely to the sound of approaching hoofbeats. That was the one thing that gave the rider away, although being made aware of the danger a split second before it struck him allowed Tarkus little more than the time necessary to raise his shield. A flash of crimson light burst through the blackness. The knight whirled in its direction and watched as it streaked across the space before him, gradually growing in size before it spread across whatever it was coating to and formed the general shape of the spear the rider was wielding. So bright was the light that the rider's form was now completely highlighted as they once again turned in the direction of the saber and launched themselves straight towards him on horseback. Tarkus would never be able to avoid them. He was slower than the average servant and even he knew that. Not even taking into account that magical horses were almost certainly bound to be faster than him, which this one proved to be. The only thing he could do was trust in his sturdiness as he raised up his shield once again and held it in front of him as the lance coated in crimson light rushed towards him. The tip of the spear struck the center of his shield. The next moment his world was consumed with heat and he felt himself lifted off the ground. Tarkus made a strangled noise as he helicoptered through the air. It felt as though the lance had exploded the very second it had made contact with him, and for all he knew it had. It would certainly explain why all he could currently see was roaring red and black flames all around him through his eyeports. Then came the landing. The knight smashed into the ground without a hint of grace and grit his teeth as he fell hard upon his shoulder. If the height had been any higher he wasn't sure if it would have broken or not. As it currently stood, his arm just hurt really badly from the landing. As he placed his other limb out to push himself up, he found himself slipping over on something wet and crashing face first into a sticky substance. Blinking several times, he then found himself understanding what had happened. Not only had the explosion blasted away the snow from the surrounding area, but it had also superheated the moisture that was frozen and turned the ground beneath him into sludge. Punching his fist into the ground, Tarkus felt it bury itself up to an inch in the filth and used it as a crutch to push himself up. Then he heard it again, the galloping sound. Using his fist as an anchor point, Tarkus pushed himself off the ground and into a roll just in time to avoid the horse's hooves from crushing the back of his skull. Instead they struck the wet mud and kicked up a nasty deluge of filth which splattered across his armor as he rolled onto his back. Hastily grabbing his shield, Tarkus raised it up as the spear thrust towards him and cracked off the surface with a heavy thud. Then the rider thrust it towards him again and again and again. Continuous strikes without reprieve aimed at different sections of the shield with the clear intention of loosening his grip, and each time the servant struck it stopped Tarkus from getting back up, his legs slipping against the ground as he tried to get back to his feet or propel himself back. Unable to get any traction, the end result was just the limbs flailing against the dirt as the servant took almost lazy potshots at him. While they were mounted, Tarkus was certain he couldn't beat them. So he did what he did best. He just figured he'd have a go as best he could. Rolling to the side at the next strike, he thrust his shield upwards and shoved the lance back the way that it had come in a sudden jerk motion. While he did so, he rolled his body onto its side and used his right hand to shove against the ground and throw himself beneath the horse. Before the mounted servant even understood what was going on, Tarkus launched his body up and slammed his shoulders into the underside of the animal while dropping his shield. With a grunt of exertion, he lifted the animal into the air and managed to elicit a noise from his opponent for the first time since the battle had begun. Wah! Tarkus briefly pondered why the voice was so feminine before he gave another cry and hurled both horse and servant over his head and across the field of snow. The pair crashed into the ground a short distance from him, with the rider being thrown from their mount while the beast rolled across the ground and whined in pain both from the throw and from being struck by the battering ram of the servant in the gut. The complaints of the horse made Tarkus feel moderately guilty. He really didn't like hurting animals, but it seemed to be one of those situations where he had no choice. Unless he could kill their owner and they would vanish, then he wouldn't have to kill them at all. Stumbling to his feet, Tarkus picked his great shield up off the floor and manifested his great sword again as he marched himself towards where the rider had been thrown. He watched the servant pick themselves off the ground in silence, spiked lance still in their hands with flashes of crimson lightning dancing between the crystalline spokes jutting from the spear with faint crackles. The servant gradually turned their head to face Tarkus, revealing that while they were indeed shorter than him, that made their form no less imposing. The servant then turned to look down at their mount as they rolled in the dirt to get up before flicking their head slightly. The horse paused in its thrashings before it closed its eyes and slowly faded away back into spirit form. Tarkus watched the dismissal occur before he looked back at the servant. "I can't beat you on horse," Tarkus dumbly pointed out, feeling the need to at least ask why they got rid of the mount. "That much is obvious," the servant responded. Tarkus noted again that the voice sounded very feminine, if a little cold. "However, you have hurled me from my mount and I cannot ride upon them with you still breathing." She started to march forwards. "I shall simply do so when you have been dispatched." Tarkus gulped to himself before holding out his shield before him and preparing his greatsword at his side. The servant with the spear paused before sweeping their weapon to the right side, unleashing a blast of light from its spokes and obliterating the wave of runes that had been rushing towards them. The servant silently lowered the spear once again before returning their sights to Tarkus and staring at him in silence. Taking a deep breath, Tarkus adjusted his positioning before he rushed forwards and brought his sword down. The servant leaned to the side to avoid the strike before throwing out their fist and punching him in the side directly where his ribs were. The punch itself packed much more weight than someone with their posture should have allowed, although servant strength was already ludicrous. Either way, Tarkus pulled the sword back and slashed it across towards the servant. His counterpart raised their spear vertically and blocked the attack with ease before their body suddenly erupted with magical energy, releasing a shockwave of purple and crimson light from their body and sending him skating away from them. As he looked back above his shield, he stepped back and raised it high as the servant was in the process of launching themselves towards him with their spear swinging through the air like a club. Though the spikes were intimidating enough, Tarkus could tell that most of the real danger was going to come from the light dancing around the surface of the weapon. Bracing himself as best he could, he raised his shield up to intercept the attack only to stumble when the blow landed and unleashed another explosion of crimson and purple light directly in his face. The detonation once again caused him to stagger away from his opponent, who showed no problems in powering through the force of their own attack to swing the lance up into the base of his shield and unleash another explosion. Tarkus felt his arm wildly jerk upwards, his body now exposed to the servant in front of him as he stumbled back once again. Tarkus responded with a thrust, attempting to cut the servant off before they could take advantage of the guard break. With a quick swipe of their spear, the servant parried the thrust directly into the ground before drawing their own weapon back. Twisting his body, Tarkus hurled himself forwards and slammed his shoulder directly into their torso before ripping his greatsword from the ground and swinging it upwards. The servant adjusted the position of their armguard, catching the blow and redirecting it towards the helmet. Tarkus' sword glanced along the surface of the armor with a grind of metal on metal before catching one of the horns and snapping the head to the side. The servant took a step with the blow before their head instantly shifted to face him once again as he brought up his shield with the clear intent to ram them. Twisting their body to free up their spear arm, the servant rocketed forwards with a sudden propulsion of speed and beat Tarkus to his own plan, slamming the left side of their body into his shield and holding him in place while bringing up their lance once again. Tarkus leaned forwards, attempting to push the servant back while they did much the same, both straining against the brute strength of their opposite. It was at this point that Tarkus' opponent did something else. Their head turned back in the direction of the caravan, catching sight of the sudden dousing of the flames and deducing that the people were soon going to be attempting an escape. Raising up their spear, the tip of the weapon started to glow an ethereal red which soon spread across the surface of the lance. With sudden realization of what they were about to do, Tarkus gave a roar as he shoved back with all his might while angling his shield up at the same time. The end result was a blast of magical energy leaving the spear and being directed skywards, cleaving effortlessly through the storm clouds and carving a thin path through them by which the night sky could be seen. The opposing servant dug their feet into the ground to halt their retreat as they reached around and grasped the edge of Tarkus' shield with a clawed gauntlet. Their left hand clenched down with all their might and pulled. Tarkus, already in the middle of pushing the servant, could do very little to stop himself before he suddenly found the resistance in front of his shield vanished and turned into something that was encouraging his charge. Stumbling forwards with a surprised gasp, he made a halfway turn before pain flashed through the side of his body and he locked up. His eyes glanced down to his left side and instantly took notice of the barbed spear which had penetrated through his hardened armor and out of his body. His eyes shifted back to his opponent. The dragon-shaped helm stared back at him without a hint of anything. His shield elbow swung up and slammed directly into the face of his attacker. They stumbled backwards with a grunt. Tarkus grit his teeth and wrenched himself free of being impaled with a crack of metal and a sickening squelch. It was a good thing he was undead because he figured that would have hurt a lot more otherwise. Turning back around to face his opponent, he watched as they shook their head and returned their attention to him as he raised his shield once again, this time covering his left side to hide the hole that was now running from the front of his body to the back. Dark blood dripped from the wound, running down his armor and falling to the ground, dirtying the snow. The spear wielder gave Tarkus another once-over glance before seemingly coming to a realization. Whatever it was, Tarkus himself wasn't privy to it, but they angled their body forwards before hurling themselves towards him, sweeping their spear through the ground and hurling forth a river of magical energy towards the night. Rolling to the right, Tarkus narrowly managed to avoid getting caught in the attack before he swiftly got back to his feet and countered with a sweeping attack to the neck of his opponent. The servant twisted their body and raised their lance up with tip pointed towards. Tarkus' greatsword struck the spear and bounced off when they pushed back, angling their grip once against and swinging the weapon like a club towards him. A wooden fist erupted from the ground, striking the side of the enemy servant and sending them into a stumble. The hatched-together limb uncurled its fingers and returned back to the ground as Tarkus jolted in surprise at the sudden intervention. "Run, pal." Siyu's voice carried over the wind, "This one is just built different." Tarkus was hesitant to follow through with the advice. If he left them be, then there was every chance they were going to launch another attack with the beam once again. However, from the tone of voice of the caster it was clear to even Tarkus that he had some sort of plan. The Knight of Black Iron might not have been very good at planning, but he could at least understand that it was something people did. He watched as the enemy knight reorientated themselves and shook their head before focusing upon him once again, then paused and shifted their attention skywards as the clouds above their head rumbled ominously. Flashes of light danced just above the storm, and that was more than enough warning that Tarkus needed. Turning on his heel, he bounded back the way he had come and rushed towards the general direction of Siyu. "Let's see you have a go at this," Siyu called out, sweeping his hand before himself and sending another set of glowing blue runes high into the sky, the divine words mingling amidst the storm clouds and further spurring on the reaction in the storm. The enemy servant turned their heads skywards just in time for Siyu to swing his arm down and point at them. Tarkus slid to a halt and turned around at the flash of light that blurred his vision and the force of an explosion that almost knocked him on his back. A bolt of thick lightning descended from the sky, falling upon the enemy servant and consuming their entire form. Crackles of smaller bolts fell frequently, supporting the larger attack as it continued to strike at the spot where the servant had been standing. "Run!" Cu called out, already backing away as he pointed his armored forearm at the enemy servant. "Fast as you can all manage it now." While he was never one to personally like fleeing from the enemy, he could at least tell when he was outmatched. Even with the help of Tall, Simple and Strong, this was one such time. Especially when he had managed to glance at the amount of raw magical energy the servant had been hurling around as if it was nothing. As Tarkus rushed past him, he felt a trickle of sweat drip down his brow, shifting his feet and preparing to flee himself. Then the base of the lightning exploded outwards. Raw magical energy tore apart the ground and sent patches of snow and mud dozens of feet into the air as the epicenter rapidly expanded outwards in a ball of crimson and violet flames. Both Cu and Tarkus felt themselves get hurled by the impact, Tarkus' heavier frame crashing into the ground and sinking beneath the snow while Cu did several flips and landed roughly on the ground. Shaking his head, he shifted his vision back to the point of origin and stared at the wall of flames which now lay before him. The fire parted, the armored knight stepped out from in between them. Their armor looked marginally scorched but otherwise undamaged, and with the spear in their right hand positively glowing like a bright red star, the light morphing to form a vague outline of their weapon. Cu blanched. "Fuck this," he muttered out as he scrambled back and turned around before breaking into a sprint, shouting out at the top of his lungs for those at the back of the column to do the same. Tarkus pulled himself from the snow and shook his head several times, reaching up with his right hand and smacking the side of his helmet to shake out some of the bits of snow that had gotten stuck in the gap around his neck. Picking himself back up, he paused as he noticed the fleeing people before turning around and seeing the servant menacingly marching towards him. The dragon roared, jaw snapping open and dislodging Stall from its grip as the heart-shaped spear of the new servant slammed directly into its neck. The user having hurled the weapon with tremendous accuracy and power as they ran and didn't even stop as the spear made contact. Leaping through the air, they grasped the polearm of the weapon and placed their boots atop the scales and twisted it. The dragon leaned back onto its hind legs and rose up like a man, staggering backwards and rapidly shaking its head back and forth to try and free itself from the new arrival now clinging to it like a bug. Torin saw a chance where he could, pointing to Marie and shouting out, "The chest, ram the chest." The French queen nodded once from atop her glass horse and bounded forwards, leaning towards the front of the crystalline animal as it charged before it kicked off the ground. Marie herself flung herself from the mount and rolled across the ground as the construct carried on, smashing into the gut of the dragon and shattering into hundreds of sharp fragments. The shotgun blast of magical crystals shredded the underbelly of the beast and caused it to release another ear-piercing cry as it fell backwards. Its titanic body crashed into the snow with a heavy thud, the actual beast making an effort to roll itself back onto its legs. Torin was having none of it. His axe struck the ground and the words flowed forth from between his lips. All the while Stall ran forwards and grabbed a hold of its tail in order to stop it from trying to rise back up, continually pulling on it and dragging it back down whenever it tried to move. Roots emerged from the ground once again, the thin branches wrapping around the dragon's neck and limbs to hold it in place long enough to deliver the decisive blow. "The heart," Torin called out, a clear struggle in his voice as he fought against the power of the dragon trying to break free, destroy the heart. Whether or not anyone heard him didn't matter much. Stall let go of the tail and manifested their large axe in their hand. The berserker climbed atop the dragon and hefted the weapon into the sky. Lightning crackled around the blade and exploded forth from the weapon, shooting every which way and scoring glancing burns across the skin before being brought down on the chest of the beast with an explosive crunch. The chest of the dragon collapsed inwards as scales were sent flying in every direction feasible. The body of the dragon soon went limp as blood poured forth from the new gaping hole in the center of the torso just above where the heart was. Torin slumped his shoulders forwards, breathing heavily for several moments before he turned around and furrowed his brows. The caravan was in a state of panic, charging forth into the smothered inferno that lay before them and in between the walls of flame in an effort to get through. "Stop panicking," Torin called out as he waded towards them. "Don't run, don't rue." An explosion went off at the far end of the caravan. Torin's head snapped towards it and watched as Cu came bounding out of the snow and charging towards them with a pale look on his face. "Run!" he shouted out while waving his arms. briefly pausing as he caught sight of the new arrival before another explosion of violet light had him look over his shoulder and slam his catalyst into the ground, blocking the outskirts of the flames before they reached him, still waving his hands towards the fleeing people. Run, go. Torin stared at him in shock. Cider, what is the meaning of servant attack? CU called back with a noticeable strain in his voice. Powerful one. The big guy is. A black suit of armor rushed past him before he could finish his words, bouncing across the ground like a stone across a pond before it rolled to a halt. His armor cracked and shattered with the leftmost portion of his body all but gone beneath his ribs. Tarkus heaved as he spat out a wad of blood from beneath his helm, gasping repeatedly as he tried to push himself back up and failing to do so, his arms wavering under the strain of having to support his weight and still pushed to his limits from having to battle the servant from before. Torin stared down at Tarkus with clear shock before he looked up, watching as the burning red lance emerged from the storm, the light it unleashed illuminating the shorter stature of its owner but doing nothing to contain the whirling mass of magical energy that surrounded them like a tornado. The figure ceased walking, horned helmet passing glancing over the servants before them before finally resting their eyes upon the corpse of the dragon that had accompanied them. So you felled the beast? The voice behind the helmet stated as they watched the white-haired servant jump from the top of the dragon and land on the ground, narrowing their eyes towards them. The servant then took a single step backwards before taking another. Accept this as your victory, if only barely. They called out before turning around. I came only to test your strength. Should we meet on the field of battle again, I shall crush you. With their words delivered, the servant retreated back the way they had come and vanished into the storm. A roaring neigh was soon heard by the group before a galloping noise faded away into the distance. Olga was still staring at the storm where the servant had retreated, slumped upon the ground and shaking ever so slightly. Her eyes shifted away from them and towards the spot where the caravan was fleeing to, her breaths coming out as little more than pants. Torin lowered his axe before he pointed towards the fleeing caravan. Chase them down and calm them. He ordered CU before pointing to the new arrival. We will speak later. Then turned to Olga and paused for a moment. Get her on her feet and get us moving again. He glanced back over his shoulder to where the servant had retreated. This storm has brought enough pain, I should think. An. As expected, Artoria Lancer altered demolished Tarkus, poor guy. Nothing against him, but she's just built different. Mana burst A+ just as that, not to mention Rano Bongo. Anyway, trouble vanquishing a dragon, quite a few dead and a whole other mess. In other words, it was a, by the skin of their teeth, victory.